Millers Creek Community Park should have been filled with children's laughter that sunny Saturday morning. Instead, screams echoed across the playground as a massive German Shepherd mix, foam dripping from its jaws, charged through families like a living nightmare. Parents grabbed their kids and ran. Teenagers scrambled over fences. Even the park rangers backed away, radios crackling with calls for animal control. Then, Frank Morrison stepped forward. The 70-year-old man with the weathered face and steady hands didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply walked toward the snarling beast while everyone else fled in terror. What happened next defied everything witnesses thought they knew about wild animals and human nature. You see, Frank wasn't just any retired park ranger. Deep in the Montana wilderness, he'd spent 30 years mastering something most people never even attempt. His connection with wildlife went beyond training, beyond science. It touched something primal and profound. But why did this particular dog stop attacking the moment it saw Frank's face? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started peacefully enough. Frank had been sitting on his usual bench near the duck pond, nursing his black coffee and watching early joggers make their rounds. At 70, his routine rarely varied. Coffee at dawn, a walk through the park, then home to tend his small garden. Simple pleasures for a man who'd seen enough wilderness drama to last several lifetimes. The first sign of trouble came as a low growl from the tree line bordering the playground. Frank's trained ear caught it immediately, a sound that made his spine straighten and his senses sharpen. 30 years in Glacier National Park had taught him to read danger in the subtlest signs. This wasn't the growl of a territorial dog protecting its space. This was something else entirely. The German Shepherd emerged from the shadows like a creature possessed. Its black and tan coat was matted with dirt and what looked like dried blood. Foam gathered at the corners of its mouth, and its eyes held that telltale glassy look Frank had seen too many times before. Rabies, or something close to it. The dog's first victim was a morning jogger who never saw it coming. The animal launched itself at the woman's legs, sending her sprawling across the paved path. Her screams pierced the morning air as she scrambled away, her workout clothes torn but mercifully intact. That's when the real chaos began. Children playing on the swings, scattered like leaves in a windstorm. A father scooped up his toddler and vaulted over a picnic table. 2 park employees backed toward their maintenance truck, one speaking rapidly into his radio while the other grabbed a rake as an improvised weapon. The dog moved with terrifying purpose, not randomly, but with calculated aggression. It charged a group of teenagers sharing breakfast sandwiches, forcing them to abandon their bikes and scale the fence surrounding the tennis courts. Glass bottles shattered as people dropped everything to flee. "Stay back! Everyone stay back!" shouted Officer Martinez, the park security guard, as she emerged from the visitor center. But her voice carried an edge of panic that did nothing to calm the situation. Frank watched it all unfold from his bench, his weathered hands still wrapped around his coffee mug. To any observer, he might have seemed frozen with fear, but inside his mind was working with the methodical precision that had made him one of the most respected rangers in the National Park Service. He'd seen rabid animals before, bears mostly, but also wolves, coyotes, even a mountain lion once. The protocol was always the same: contain, isolate, and wait for professionals with tranquilizer guns. Never engage directly, never try to play hero. But something about this dog struck him as different. The way it moved, the pattern of its attacks, there was intelligence there, buried beneath the madness. And when the animal paused in its rampage and turned toward Frank's section of the park, their eyes met across 50 yards of open grass. The dog went completely still. Frank set down his coffee mug with deliberate care and rose to his feet. His knees protested, too many years hiking mountain trails, but his movements remained fluid and controlled. Around him, the few remaining people in the park pressed themselves against buildings and cars, some filming with their phones despite the danger. "Sir! Sir, get back!" Officer Martinez called out, but Frank was already walking forward. The dog watched his approach with an intensity that made Frank's chest tighten. There was something familiar about those eyes, something that tugged at a memory he couldn't quite place. As he drew closer, details became clearer. The animal was massive, probably close to 90 pounds, with the broad chest and powerful hindquarters of a working dog. Its ears were alert despite its obvious distress, and there, barely visible beneath the matted fur of its neck, was the faded outline of what might have been a collar. Frank stopped 20 feet away and did something that made every witness hold their breath. He knelt down and extended his hand. The morning sun cast long shadows across Riverside Park as Detective Sarah Chen crouched beside the motionless form of what had been, just hours before, a terror that sent families screaming from playgrounds. The German Shepherd lay peaceful now, its massive chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, completely unconscious but very much alive. 23 witnesses, her partner Detective Mike Rodriguez said, flipping through his notepad. 23 people saw the same impossible thing, and not one of them can explain how the old man did it. Sarah studied the dog's foam-crusted muzzle, the telltale sign of rabies still evident. Animal Control had confirmed the diagnosis with a quick field test, but somehow the beast now slept like a family pet. What exactly did they see? That's just it. Nobody knows. Mrs. Patterson from the flower shop says the old guy walked right up to the dog while it was mid-attack on the Morrison kid's bicycle. She swears the animal stopped snarling the moment it saw him. Then he knelt down, put his hands on either side of its head, and whispered something. Whispered what? Mike shrugged. No one was close enough to hear, but here's the weird part. 3 different witnesses say the dog's eyes changed, went from wild and red to normal, like it recognized him. Dr. Amanda Foster from the county veterinary clinic approached, her expression puzzled as she examined the sedated animal. "This doesn't make medical sense," she murmured, checking the dog's pupils with a penlight. "Rabies doesn't just pause. The virus attacks the nervous system progressively. Once an animal reaches the aggressive stage, there's no coming back without—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "Without what?" Sarah pressed. "Nothing. There is no without. This shouldn't be possible." Amanda sat back on her heels, studying the peaceful animal. "I've been treating rabid animals for 15 years, Detective Chen. They don't take naps in the middle of psychotic episodes." Sarah's radio crackled to life. "All units. We have reports of an elderly male matching yesterday's description seen entering the Riverside district. White hair, worn leather jacket, walking with a slight limp." "That's him," Mike said, already heading toward their patrol car. "The mystery man." They found him 2 blocks away, sitting on a bench outside Murphy's diner, feeding breadcrumbs to a gathering of pigeons. Up close, he appeared even more weathered than the witnesses had described. Deep lines etched his face like rivers carved into stone, and his eyes held a weight that seemed to press down on everything around him. "Excuse me, sir," Sarah said, approaching slowly. "I'm Detective Chen. Could we have a word?" The man looked up, and Sarah felt an odd chill run down her spine. His eyes were the palest blue she'd ever seen, almost grey, and they seemed to look through her rather than at her. "I suppose you're here about yesterday," he said quietly. His voice carried a slight accent she couldn't place, something European, maybe Eastern European. "We're trying to understand what happened at the park," Mike said, settling onto the bench beside him. "Multiple witnesses saw you approach a rabid dog. That's extremely dangerous." A sad smile crossed the old man's features. "Dangerous? Yes, I suppose it was." He scattered the remaining breadcrumbs and watched the pigeons flutter around his feet. "My name is Emil Kovac. I used to work with animals many years ago." "What kind of work?" Sarah asked, pulling out her notepad. Emil was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I was a researcher. In my home country before the war, we studied animal behavior, communication patterns, how creatures connect with each other and sometimes with humans. That still doesn't explain how you calmed a rabid animal," Mike pressed. "Doesn't it?" Emil stood slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. "Tell me, detective, what do you know about memory? About trauma that runs so deep it becomes hereditary, passed down through generations?" Sarah frowned. "Are you talking about the dog or yourself?" "Both, perhaps." Emil began walking away, then paused. "The animal you found, it wasn't just rabid, was it? Something else was wrong. Something in its eyes." "How could you possibly know that?" Sarah called after him. But Emil was already disappearing around the corner, leaving only the faint scent of pine and old leather, and the unsettling feeling that they'd just spoken with someone carrying secrets far heavier than a simple encounter with a sick animal. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Foster, "Emergency at the clinic. The dog is awake, and you need to see this. Come now." As they rushed back toward their car, Mike shook his head. "That old man knows something he's not telling us." Sarah watched Emil's figure vanish into the crowd, her instincts screaming that this case was about to become much more complicated than a routine animal incident. Whatever Emil Kovac was hiding, she had the distinct feeling it would change everything they thought they knew about what happened in that park. The crowd pressed closer despite Deputy Martinez's outstretched arms, their collective breath forming clouds in the crisp morning air. Sarah clutched her phone, the video still recording as she watched the impossible scene unfold before them. The rabid dog, moments ago a snarling, foam-flecked nightmare, now sat perfectly still beside the elderly stranger, its massive head resting against his weathered palm. "Sir, I need you to step away from the animal," Martinez called out, his voice carrying the authority of his badge but betraying an underlying tremor. His hand hovered near his service weapon, though he seemed reluctant to draw it with the old man so close to the beast. The stranger didn't acknowledge the deputy's words. Instead, he continued his low murmuring, words too soft for anyone else to catch. His fingers moved through the dog's matted fur with practiced gentleness, and Sarah noticed something that made her stomach lurch. Dried blood caked the animal's muzzle and front paws, evidence of whatever carnage had preceded this moment. "Jesus Christ," whispered Tom Fletcher from behind her. "Look at its eyes." Sarah zoomed in with her phone's camera and saw what he meant. The wild, rolling eyes that had terrorized them minutes earlier now seemed almost peaceful, fixed on the old man's face with something approaching recognition. The thick foam still gathered at the corners of the dog's mouth, but its breathing had slowed from the previous desperate panting. A new voice cut through the crowd's murmur. "That's Rex." Everyone turned to see Margaret Whitmore pushing through the gathered people, her face pale but determined. As the town's longtime veterinarian, her word carried weight. "I treated him last month for a hip injury. He belongs to the Hendricks family on Maple Street." "Ma'am, please stay back," Martinez warned, but Margaret had already moved closer, studying the scene with professional interest. "This isn't possible," she said, more to herself than anyone else. "Rabies doesn't just pause like this. The neurological damage, the aggression, it's not something you can simply calm away." The old man finally looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting Margaret's gaze across the 20 feet that separated them. "Sometimes," he said, his voice carrying clearly now, "pain recognizes pain." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. There was something haunting in the stranger's words, a depth of sadness that seemed to resonate from somewhere deep within his chest. She watched as he continued to stroke the dog's head, and she noticed his hands, scarred and gnarled, with what looked like old bite marks along his forearms. "Sir, regardless of what you're doing, that animal is dangerous." Martinez tried again. "We've had reports of attacks. Someone could be seriously hurt." "Someone already has been." The old man's response was barely above a whisper, but in the morning stillness everyone heard it. His eyes never left the dog's face as he spoke. "Haven't you, boy? You're hurting so much you can't think straight." Margaret took another step forward, her veterinary instincts overriding her caution. "How long has he been like this?" she called out. "Hours," the stranger replied. "Maybe longer. He came to me just after dawn, covered in..." He paused, swallowing hard. He tried to fight it, this thing eating away at his mind. But it's too strong now. The crowd stirred uneasily at his words. Sarah noticed several people backing away, suddenly remembering why they'd been terrified in the first place. But she found herself moving closer, drawn by the profound sadness in the scene before her. "You talk like you know him," Margaret observed. The old man's hand stilled for a moment against the dog's fur. "I know what it's like to lose yourself," he said quietly. "To have something inside you that you can't control, that makes you dangerous to the people you love." Sarah's phone captured every word, every gesture, but she barely paid attention to the recording anymore. She was transfixed by the connection between man and animal, by the way the dog seemed to understand that this stranger offered not just comfort, but genuine comprehension of its torment. "What's your name?" she found herself asking, her voice cutting through the morning air. The old man looked at her then, and she saw something flicker across his features, surprise, perhaps, or recognition of some kind. "Frank," he said simply. "Frank Morrison." Several people in the crowd exchanged glances. The name meant nothing to most of them, but Sarah caught the sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Chen, who ran the town's historical society. "Morrison," Mrs. Chen repeated, her voice barely audible. "Oh my God." But before anyone could ask what she meant, the dog shifted against Frank's hand, a low whimper escaping its throat. Frank's expression tightened, and he leaned down to whisper something directly into the animal's ear. "What's he doing?" someone called out. Frank looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Saying goodbye." The crowd pressed closer despite Deputy Martinez's frantic gestures to stay back. Word had spread through Pine Grove faster than wildfire, and now nearly half the town seemed to have gathered at the park's edge. Cell phones emerged from pockets, recording the impossible scene unfolding before them. Samuel remained motionless beside the German shepherd, his weathered hand still resting on the animal's massive head. The dog's breathing had steadied, its eyes no longer wild with the madness that had terrorized the park moments before. Instead, something almost human flickered in those dark pupils. Recognition, perhaps even gratitude. "Jesus Christ!" whispered Tommy Hartwell, the teenager who'd first spotted the rabid animal. "How's he doing that?" Dr. Elena Vasquez pushed through the gathering crowd, her veterinary bag clutched tightly in one hand. She'd received Martinez's frantic call just as she was closing her clinic for the day. Now, seeing the scene before her, she questioned everything she thought she knew about animal behavior and disease progression. "Sir," she called out, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm a veterinarian. That animal needs immediate medical attention." Samuel's head turned slightly, acknowledging her presence without breaking his connection with the dog. "She's not sick," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "She's dying." The distinction hit Dr. Vasquez like a physical blow. In her 15 years of practice, she'd seen countless cases of rabies, but never anything like this. The aggression, the frothing, the complete loss of rational behavior, all textbook symptoms. Yet now the animal lay peacefully, as if those symptoms had never existed. "That's impossible," she murmured, taking a cautious step forward. "The neurological damage from rabies doesn't just reverse itself." Samuel's eyes met hers, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch. Pain. Deep, ancient pain that seemed to encompass more than one lifetime of sorrow. "She was exposed to something worse than rabies," he said, his hand moving in slow, gentle strokes along the dog's neck. "Poison. Industrial runoff from the old chemical plant upstream. It mimics the symptoms, but works faster, crueler." Deputy Martinez lowered his weapon slightly, confusion evident on his face. "How could you possibly know that?" The old man was quiet for a long moment, his attention focused entirely on the suffering animal. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, yet somehow everyone present heard every word. "Because I've seen it before, too many times." Sarah Chen, the park's maintenance supervisor, who had called in the initial report, found herself drawn forward despite every instinct screaming at her to maintain distance. There was something about the elderly man's presence that seemed to calm not just the dog, but the very air around them. "The creek," she said suddenly, pieces clicking together in her mind. "We've had 3 dogs come through here in the past month showing similar symptoms. All of them had been drinking from Miller's Creek." Samuel nodded grimly. "The old Hartwell chemical plant. Shut down 15 years ago, but the cleanup was rushed, incomplete. Every heavy rain washes more toxins downstream." Tommy Hartwell's face went pale at the mention of his family name. His grandfather's company had been the largest employer in Pine Grove before environmental regulations forced its closure. The settlement money had built the park where they now stood, a gesture meant to heal the community. Apparently, the healing had been only surface deep. Dr. Vasquez knelt a few feet away, studying the dog with professional fascination. The animal's pupils were returning to normal size, its breathing becoming more regular, yet she could see the truth in its labored movements. Whatever brief respite Samuel had provided, it was temporary. "How long does she have?" the veterinarian asked quietly. "Minutes," Samuel replied, his hand never ceasing its gentle motion. "The neurological damage is too extensive, but she's not afraid anymore. That's what matters." As if responding to his words, the German shepherd lifted her head slightly and looked directly at him. In that gaze was an intelligence that transcended species, a moment of connection that left several witnesses wiping tears from their eyes. "Who are you?" Deputy Martinez asked, his weapon now holstered. "How do you know so much about this?" Samuel's smile was sad but genuine. "Someone who spent too many years cleaning up messes that others preferred to forget." The dog's breathing grew shallower, and Samuel leaned closer, whispering something that only she could hear. Whatever he said seemed to bring her peace, because her body relaxed completely for the first time since anyone had seen her that day. "She's gone," Dr. Vasquez said softly, though everyone present could see the truth of it. Samuel remained beside the still form for another moment before slowly rising to his feet. The crowd watched in respectful silence as he brushed dirt from his knees and looked around at the faces surrounding him. "There will be others," he said simply, "unless someone does something about that creek." The silence that followed Samuel's communion with the dying dog stretched like a taut wire across the park. Detective Maria Santos found herself holding her breath, watching as the old man cradled the massive German shepherd's head in his weathered hands. The animal's chest rose and fell in labored rhythms, each breath a struggle against whatever poison coursed through its veins. "We need to get that dog to a veterinarian," Maria said, breaking the spell that seemed to have fallen over the gathered crowd. But Samuel shook his head without looking up. "It's too late for that," he murmured, his voice carrying an authority that made her step back. "But it's not too late for the truth." The dog's eyes, no longer wild with rage but clouded with pain, fixed on Samuel's face. Its tongue lolled out, foam still clinging to its jaws, but the aggressive panting had slowed to exhausted gasps. Maria watched, transfixed, as Samuel began to hum, a low, melodic sound that seemed to resonate from deep within his chest. Dr. Jennifer Hayes pushed through the crowd, her medical bag clutched tightly in her hands. She'd been jogging through the park when the screaming started, and now she knelt beside Samuel, her trained eyes assessing the situation with clinical precision. "Sir, that animal could still be dangerous," she warned. But Samuel's humming continued, and incredibly, the dog's breathing began to steady. "Look at its eyes," Samuel said softly. "Really look." Samuel's hands moved gently along the dog's neck, feeling for something. When his fingers found what they were seeking, his face hardened with a fury that made the air around him seem to crackle with electricity. Embedded just beneath the thick fur, almost invisible to the casual observer, was a small puncture wound. "Someone did this," he said, his voice carrying across the park like a death knell. "Someone injected this poor creature with something to make it aggressive, to make it attack." The crowd began to murmur, voices rising in confusion and disbelief. Maria stepped closer, her detective instincts finally overriding her amazement at Samuel's inexplicable connection with the animal. "Are you saying this was intentional?" she asked, pulling out her phone to call for backup and a veterinary team. "That someone deliberately turned a gentle family pet into a weapon," Samuel finished, his eyes blazing with an anger that seemed to age him and make him appear ancient and terrible at the same time. "This dog's name is Rex. He belongs to the Morrison family on Elm Street. Yesterday he was playing fetch with 8-year-old Tommy Morrison in their backyard. Jennifer's medical training kicked in as she examined the injection site more carefully. If someone used a combination of stimulants and hallucinogens, it could definitely trigger extreme aggressive behavior," she confirmed. "But why would anyone do such a thing?" Samuel's expression grew distant, as if he were seeing something far beyond the park, beyond the present moment. "Because some people understand that fear is the most powerful weapon of all," he said quietly. "Create enough fear, enough chaos, and you can justify almost anything." The dog, Rex, let out a soft whimper, and Samuel returned his attention to the dying animal. His hands moved in gentle, soothing strokes along the dog's fur, and that strange humming resumed. To Maria's amazement, the dog's tail gave a weak wag. "How is this possible?" she breathed, but Samuel didn't answer. Instead, he leaned down and whispered something in the dog's ear, words too soft for anyone else to hear. Dr. Hayes worked quickly, administering a sedative that would ease Rex's final moments. As the drug took effect, the dog's breathing slowed further, but its eyes remained fixed on Samuel's face with an expression that looked disturbingly like gratitude. "There's something else," Samuel said, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Whoever did this, they're not finished. Rex was just the beginning, a test run." "A test run for what?" Maria demanded, but even as she asked the question, a chill ran down her spine. In the distance she could hear sirens approaching, but they seemed too far away, too late. Samuel looked up at her then, and in his eyes she saw knowledge that went far deeper than anyone should possess, knowledge that spoke of patterns and connections that spanned years, maybe decades. "For something much worse," he said simply. As Rex drew his last breath, Samuel's hands never stopped their gentle stroking, never stopped offering comfort to a creature that had been transformed from beloved pet to unwilling monster by human cruelty. The crowd began to disperse as emergency vehicles arrived, but Maria remained frozen in place, staring at the mysterious old man who somehow knew exactly what was happening in her town, and what was coming next. The morning sun cast long shadows across the veterinary clinic as Dr. Sarah Chen arrived earlier than usual, her mind still reeling from the events at the park. She'd barely slept, haunted by the image of the elderly man's transformation when he'd approached the rabid dog. There had been something almost supernatural about the way the animal had responded to him, as if recognizing an old friend. She pushed through the clinic doors to find Marcus already there, sitting in the waiting area with a steaming cup of coffee and dark circles under his eyes. He looked up as she entered, his expression grim. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, hanging her coat on the hook behind the reception desk. Marcus shook his head. "I keep thinking about what that man said, about the dog choosing him." He paused, taking a sip of his coffee. "Sarah, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened yesterday." Before she could respond, the bell above the door chimed, and Thomas Whitmore stepped inside. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the clinic, he looked even more weathered than he had at the park, his face etched with lines that spoke of profound loss. He carried himself differently now, too, as if the weight of yesterday's events had added years to his already considerable burden. "Dr. Chen," he said quietly, his voice carrying that same gentle authority she remembered. "I hope you don't mind the early hour. I wanted to speak with you before your regular day began." Sarah gestured toward her office. "Of course. Please come in." The three of them settled into the small space. Thomas taking the chair across from Sarah's desk while Marcus leaned against the doorframe. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Thomas finally spoke. "I suppose you have questions about yesterday?" "That would be an understatement," Sarah replied, studying his face. "Mr. Whitmore, what you did with that dog, it defied everything I know about rabies, about animal behavior, about basic biology." Thomas nodded slowly, his hands folded in his lap. "I imagine it did." He was quiet for a long moment, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Tell me, Dr. Chen, do you believe in connections that transcend our understanding of the natural world?" "I believe in science," she said carefully. "But I also believe that science doesn't have all the answers. Not yet." A ghost of a smile crossed Thomas's face. A diplomatic answer. He looked out the small window behind her desk, watching as the town began to wake up. "I wasn't always the man you see before you. Once I had a different life, a different understanding of the world." Marcus stepped forward. "What kind of different life?" Thomas's eyes grew distant. "I was a researcher, actually, spent 30 years studying animal behavior, focusing specifically on the neurological effects of rabies. I published papers, received grants, thought I understood the disease better than almost anyone." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I was wrong about everything that mattered." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "You're saying you're a scientist?" "Was," Thomas corrected. "I gave up that life 12 years ago after—" He trailed off, his hands tightening in his lap. "After I lost everything that made it meaningful." The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Sarah found herself leaning forward, drawn in despite her skepticism. "Mr. Whitmore, the way that dog responded to you yesterday wasn't normal. Even if you have experience with rabid animals, what I witnessed goes beyond any scientific explanation I know." Thomas met her gaze, and she saw something raw and painful in his eyes. "You're right, it wasn't normal, but neither was the dog." "What do you mean?" "That animal, he wasn't just any stray that wandered into town. He was deliberately seeking something, or someone." Thomas stood up slowly, walking to the window. "Dr. Chen, have you ever encountered a case where a rabid animal displayed selective aggression, where it attacked some people but ignored others entirely?" Sarah exchanged glances with Marcus. "No, that's not how the disease works. Rabies affects the brain in very specific ways. Infected animals typically show aggression toward anything that moves, or they become completely withdrawn." "Exactly," Thomas said, turning back to face them. "But this dog showed neither pattern. He was aggressive, yes, but there was intelligence behind it. Purpose." He paused, his expression growing even more grave. "I recognize that intelligence, Dr. Chen. I'd seen it before, in another animal, in another life." "You're talking about your research?" Thomas shook his head. "I'm talking about my daughter." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Sarah felt her breath catch as the implications of what he'd said began to sink in. "Mr. Whitmore," she said slowly, "what happened to your daughter?" Thomas returned to his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 70-odd years. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "She was bitten by a rabid animal 12 years ago, but before she died, she discovered something about the disease that changed everything I thought I knew." The morning after Victor's revelation brought an unusual quiet to Millbrook. Word had spread overnight about the old man's extraordinary gift, carried from house to house through whispered phone calls and hushed conversations over backyard fences. By dawn, a small crowd had already gathered outside the veterinary clinic where Victor had spent the night, their faces pressed against the windows like children at a candy store. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived to find nearly 30 people waiting in her parking lot. She pushed through the crowd, her keys jingling nervously as reporters thrust microphones toward her face and camera flashes exploded in rapid succession. "Dr. Chen, is it true he can speak to animals? What did he do to that dog? Is this some kind of hoax?" Sarah ignored them all, slipping inside and locking the door behind her. She found Victor in the back room, sitting cross-legged on the floor beside the German Shepherd's cage. The dog, whom they'd temporarily named Hope, was lying peacefully with her head resting near the cage door, as close to Victor as the bars would allow. She had nightmares, Victor said without looking up. The virus, it creates such terrible confusion in their minds. She dreamed she was still lost in that darkness. Sarah knelt beside him, studying the dog's relaxed posture. Hope's breathing was steady, her eyes clear and focused. The transformation seemed impossible, yet here was the evidence before her own eyes. Victor, there are people outside. Reporters, scientists, government officials. Word is spreading fast. He nodded slowly, his weathered hand reaching through the bars to stroke Hope's muzzle. I knew this day would come eventually. I've been hiding for so long, but perhaps it's time. Time for what? Victor's eyes grew distant, to tell them about the others. Before Sarah could ask what he meant, a sharp knock echoed from the front door. Through the window she could see a man in a dark suit holding up an official-looking badge. FBI. Dr. Chen, we need to speak with you and your patient immediately. Sarah looked to Victor, but he was already standing, his expression resigned yet determined. Let them in, Sarah, but first, I need you to understand something important. He moved to the window, gazing out at the crowd that had swollen to nearly 100 people. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like mechanical sunflowers. 15 years ago, I worked for a pharmaceutical company. We were developing new treatments for neurological disorders, pushing the boundaries of what science thought possible about consciousness and communication. His voice carried the weight of old guilt. I discovered something extraordinary, a way to bridge the gap between human and animal consciousness. But my colleagues, they wanted to weaponize it. Sarah felt her blood run cold. Weaponize? How? Imagine being able to control animals completely. Wild predators becoming perfect soldiers. Domesticated animals turned into unwitting spies. They saw dollar signs and military applications. Victor's fist clenched at his side. I tried to destroy the research, but they'd already begun human trials. On me. The knocking grew more insistent, accompanied by official voices demanding entry. The process, it changed me permanently. I can hear their thoughts, feel their emotions, understand their pain as if it were my own. Tears tracked down his weathered cheeks, but it also opened my mind to something beautiful, the pure, uncomplicated love that animals possess, their capacity for forgiveness, even toward those who've hurt them. Hope whimpered softly from her cage, as if sensing Victor's distress. He turned back to her, and Sarah watched in amazement as the dog's tail began to wag, offering comfort to the man who had saved her. I've spent 15 years in hiding, helping animals wherever I could find them, healing the sick, calming the frightened, speaking for those who have no voice. Victor straightened his shoulders. But now they've found me, and I have a choice to make. What kind of choice? Whether to let them turn this gift into another weapon, or to use this moment to show the world what animals really are, not property or tools, but conscious beings deserving of respect and protection. The front door rattled as someone tested the lock. Sarah could hear radio chatter and see more official vehicles arriving through the window. There are others like me, Victor continued quietly. The company's test subjects who survived the procedure. We've been hiding, but we've also been watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal ourselves and fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. He pulled out an old cellular phone and pressed a single number. It's time, he said simply when someone answered. Yes, I'm ready. Bring them all. Sarah stared at him in shock. All? How many others are there? Victor smiled sadly as the sound of splintering wood came from the front of the clinic. Enough to change everything, Sarah. Enough to finally give animals the voice they've always deserved. The door burst open, and heavy footsteps thundered toward them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the veterinary clinic as Dr. Sarah Chen carefully drew the blood sample from the sedated dog. The animal lay peacefully on the examination table, its breathing steady and deep. Gone was the frothing madness from the day before, replaced by an almost serene calm that defied everything she knew about rabies. This doesn't make sense. she murmured to her assistant Lisa, who was preparing slides for microscopic examination. "Look at him. Yesterday he was in the final stages of the disease, and now he looks like any normal dog having a nap," Lisa finished, shaking her head in bewilderment. "I've never seen anything like it." Dr. Chen had been a veterinarian for 23 years. She'd treated countless cases of rabies, each one following the same tragic trajectory toward death. There was no recovery from the clinical stage, no miraculous turnarounds. Yet here lay living proof that everything she thought she knew might be wrong. The blood work would take hours to process, but she had a sinking feeling it would only deepen the mystery. She'd already called the State Veterinary Office and the CDC. By afternoon, this small clinic would be crawling with specialists trying to understand what had happened in the park. Across town, Detective Rodriguez sat in his patrol car outside the Riverside Motel, watching the elderly man through the window of room 12. The stranger hadn't left his room since checking in the previous evening, and Tom found himself wrestling with questions that had kept him awake most of the night. He'd run the man's identification through every database he could access. Samuel Morrison, 74 years old, former resident of Pine Ridge, Montana. But that's where the trail went cold. No employment records for the past 15 years, no known address, no next of kin. It was as if the man had simply vanished from society decades ago, only to reappear yesterday in their small-town park to perform what could only be described as a miracle. Tom's radio crackled to life. "Detective Rodriguez, we've got Mayor Walsh on line 2. Says it's urgent." He sighed, knowing exactly what this would be about. News of yesterday's incident was already spreading beyond the town limits. Social media posts from witnesses had gone viral overnight, and the phone calls had started before dawn. News vans would probably start arriving by noon. "Tell the mayor I'll call him back in 10 minutes, Tom replied, then stepped out of his car and walked toward the motel. Samuel Morrison answered his knock on the second try. The old man looked tired, more frail than he had the day before. His eyes held a weight that seemed to press down on his shoulders. "I figured you'd be back," Samuel said quietly, stepping aside to let Tom enter. The room was sparse, containing only a worn duffel bag and a thermos of coffee. Samuel moved slowly to the single chair while Tom remained standing near the door. "People are asking questions I can't answer," Tom said. "The CDC is sending a team. There's going to be media attention. You need to help me understand what happened out there." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of buried pain. "That dog, his name was Max, golden retriever mix, about 4 years old, belonged to a family 3 towns over." He looked up at Tom. "I knew him because I've been tracking the pack that infected him for the better part of 2 years. Pack? Wolves, but not normal wolves." Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee. Something happened to them up in the Montana wilderness. Something that changed them, changed the disease itself. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of change? The rabies virus mutated. Instead of just causing madness and death, it began forming a kind of network. The infected animals could communicate with each other, coordinate their movements. They were spreading the disease deliberately, strategically. The detective's mind reeled. "That's impossible." "I thought so too, until I watched them take down my research team." Samuel's voice broke slightly. "I was a wildlife biologist, detective, had been for 40 years. We were studying wolf pack behavior when we stumbled onto something that shouldn't exist." Tom moved closer, his skepticism warring with the undeniable evidence of what he'd witnessed in the park. "The ability I showed yesterday," Samuel continued, "it didn't come naturally. I was infected too, but somehow I didn't develop the madness. Instead, I gained the ability to communicate with them, to influence the disease itself. I've been hunting the source ever since, trying to stop it from spreading." Outside, Tom could hear the distant rumble of approaching vehicles. The world was about to descend on their quiet town, demanding answers neither of them was prepared to give. "Why here?" Tom asked. "Why did that dog come here?" Samuel's expression darkened. "Because they're not random anymore, Detective. They're following a plan. And I think Pine Ridge is just the beginning." The veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Dr. Sarah Chen's weathered face as she pulled off her latex gloves with trembling hands. Behind her, the examination table held the sedated form of what had once been Maple Street's terror, now revealed as nothing more than a sick, frightened animal whose suffering had finally ended. Marcus stood in the corner, his ancient eyes fixed on the dog's peaceful form. The transformation in him was remarkable. Gone was the commanding presence that had faced down a rabid beast with nothing but whispers and touch. In its place sat a broken man, shoulders curved inward as if trying to shield his heart from further damage. "The tests confirm it," Dr. Chen said softly, her voice cutting through the sterile silence. "Advanced rabies. The poor thing was probably suffering for weeks before the symptoms became violent." She paused, studying Marcus with professional curiosity mixed with something deeper. "What you did out there, I've never seen anything like it." Marcus didn't respond immediately. His weathered hands worked nervously at the brim of his old baseball cap, a gesture Sarah had noticed whenever difficult memories surfaced. Outside, the first hints of dawn painted the clinic windows with pale gold light. 37 years, he finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "I worked with animals for 37 years. Started as a veterinary assistant when I was 17, fresh out of high school and thinking I'd save every creature that crossed my path." Detective Morrison stepped forward from where he'd been quietly observing. The investigation had taken an unexpected turn, and his cop instincts told him this moment was crucial. "Go on, Marcus. Help us understand." The old man's eyes never left the dog. "You spend that long learning to read pain, to see past the fear and aggression to the hurt underneath, and it changes you. Changes how you see everything." His voice grew stronger, carrying the weight of decades. This little guy, he wasn't evil. He was scared and sick, and his mind was burning up from the inside. Dr. Chen moved closer, her scientific mind racing. "But how did you know it was safe to approach? Rabies victims are unpredictable, especially in the later stages. You could have been killed." For the first time since entering the clinic, Marcus smiled, a sad, knowing expression that seemed to hold lifetimes of experience. "Safe? There's nothing safe about what I did, but sometimes you have to choose between fear and compassion. Sometimes the risk is worth taking if it means preventing more suffering." "You're not telling us everything," Morrison observed gently. "There's more to this story." Marcus stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement. He approached the examination table and placed a gentle hand on the dog's flank, feeling the steady rhythm of unconscious breathing. "My daughter Emma used to volunteer at the animal shelter where I worked. Brightest kid you ever saw, full of the same foolish hope I had when I started. She wanted to be a veterinarian, follow in the old man's footsteps." The room held its breath. 15 years ago we had an incident. Stray dog seemed healthy enough, but it was carrying rabies. Emma was working late, trying to socialize some of the more difficult cases. The dog got spooked, attacked before anyone could react. His voice broke slightly. She was only 19. Dr. Chen closed her eyes, understanding flooding through her. "The post-exposure treatment didn't work?" "We caught it too late. By the time the symptoms showed, there was nothing anyone could do. I held her hand while the disease took her, watched the fear and confusion in her eyes as her mind slipped away. Marcus's tears came freely now, years of suppressed grief finally finding release. She died scared and in pain, just like this little guy would have if we'd let it continue." The weight of his revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Morrison found himself re-evaluating every assumption he'd made about the mysterious old man who'd appeared from nowhere to calm a crisis. "So when you saw what was happening in the park," Dr. Chen said softly, "you couldn't let another animal suffer the same way. Or another family go through what mine did," Marcus added. Every minute that dog was loose was another chance for someone else's daughter to get hurt, another chance for the kind of pain that never really goes away. He stepped back from the table, squaring his shoulders with visible effort. I've been running from that day for 15 years, moving from town to town, thinking if I stayed away from animals, away from the work I loved, somehow the guilt would fade. But watching that crowd today, seeing the fear in those children's eyes, I realized running doesn't heal anything. Sometimes you have to face the thing that broke you. The morning sun climbed higher, painting the clinic in warm light that seemed to promise new beginnings. In the distance, Maple Street Park was already returning to normal, early joggers reclaiming their paths, the coffee shop preparing for another day of routine comfort. But for Marcus, there would be no return to the anonymous drifting that had defined his recent years. The morning sun cast long shadows across the park as Dr. Sarah Chen made her way to the makeshift medical station she'd established near the pavilion. 3 days had passed since the incident, and the elderly man, who had finally introduced himself as Thomas Whitmore, remained under careful observation. What she'd witnessed defied everything she knew about rabies transmission and animal behavior. Thomas sat on a wooden bench, his weathered hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee that Margaret Henley had brought from her diner. The dog lay beside him, no longer the frothing, aggressive creature that had terrorized the park. Instead, it rested peacefully, occasionally lifting its head when Thomas spoke in those same low, melodic tones that had first calmed the beast. "The blood work came back," Sarah said, approaching cautiously. She still couldn't shake the memory of watching Thomas place his bare hands on a rabid animal and somehow transform it into this docile companion. Thomas looked up, his pale blue eyes sharp despite his advanced age. "And what did your machines tell you, Doctor?" "That's just it. They're telling me things that shouldn't be possible." Sarah pulled out her tablet, scrolling through the results. "The dog's viral load has decreased by nearly 60%. In 3 days, Thomas. Rabies doesn't just improve. Once symptoms manifest, it's fatal, always." A small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance. Word of the miracle had spread through the town like wildfire, drawing curious onlookers and even a few reporters from neighboring counties. Chief Martinez had cordoned off the area, but people pressed against the barriers, whispering among themselves about the old man who could speak to wild animals. "There are things your science hasn't discovered yet," Thomas said quietly, his hand moving to rest on the dog's head. "Connections that run deeper than disease, older than your understanding of how life works." Sarah knelt down, maintaining her distance from the dog, but close enough to observe its breathing, its alertness. "Then help me understand. What did you do? How is this possible?" For a long moment Thomas remained silent. The dog's tail twitched, and it nuzzled closer to the old man's leg. Finally, he began to speak, his voice carrying a weight that made Sarah lean forward despite herself. 50 years ago, I was like you, a scientist, convinced that the natural world operated according to fixed rules and measurable phenomena. His fingers traced patterns in the dog's fur, and the animal's breathing seemed to synchronize with the movement. I worked for a research facility in Alaska, studying wildlife behavior and disease transmission. The crowd had grown larger, and Sarah noticed several people recording on their phones. This story would be on the internet within hours, she realized. Whatever Thomas was about to reveal would no longer be contained to their small town. "We were tracking a pack of wolves that had been infected with a modified strain of rabies, a biological weapon, though we didn't call it that back then. Just research, we told ourselves, scientific advancement." Thomas's voice grew heavier with each word. The virus was designed to be more aggressive, more transmissible. "We wanted to understand how to combat biological warfare." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What happened to the pack?" "They suffered," Thomas said simply. "For weeks, we watched through cameras and tracking devices as they deteriorated. The alpha female was the last to succumb, and when she did—" He paused, his hand stilling on the dog's head. "Something in me broke. I'd spent my life studying the intricate connections between all living things, and there I was, contributing to their destruction. The dog suddenly lifted its head, looking directly at Sarah with eyes that seemed far more aware than any rabid animal should possess. She found herself staring back, noting the absence of the glazed, aggressive look she'd expected. "That night, I walked out into the wilderness," Thomas continued. "I wanted to find where that pack had died, to bear witness to what my research had cost. I expected to freeze to death out there, and honestly, that felt like justice. But you survived," Sarah said, though it sounded more like a question. "I found something instead, or it found me." Thomas stood slowly, the dog rising with him in perfect synchronization. "There's a consciousness that connects all living things, Doctor. Indigenous peoples have known it for millennia. Some call it the Great Spirit, others simply call it love. That night, dying in the snow beside the bones of creatures I'd helped kill, I felt it for the first time." The dog looked up at Thomas with what Sarah could only describe as adoration. Not the desperate attachment of a sick animal, but something deeper, something that made her question everything she thought she knew about the boundaries between species, between consciousness and instinct. "The virus responds to it," Thomas said, meeting her eyes. "Fear and aggression feed the disease, but connection, true, deep connection, starves it. That's what your machines detected. Not magic, Doctor, just a form of medicine your textbooks haven't discovered yet." The silence that had fallen over the park after Samuel's revelation was broken only by the distant sound of sirens growing closer. Dr. Martinez knelt beside the still form of the dog, her hands moving with practiced precision as she checked for vital signs. The animal's breathing was shallow but steady, its eyes closed in what appeared to be peaceful sleep rather than the violent thrashing of disease. "This is impossible," she whispered, more to herself than to the small crowd that had gathered around them. "The neural pathways affected by rabies don't just reset themselves." Samuel remained crouched beside the dog, one weathered hand resting gently on its flank. His face had aged a decade in the past few minutes, the weight of his confession settling over him like a shroud. "Nothing about any of this should be possible," he said quietly. "But here we are." Maya stepped closer, her reporter's instincts warring with her human compassion. She had witnessed something that defied explanation, but the pain radiating from the old man was all too real and familiar. "Samuel," she said gently, "what exactly happened to your daughter?" His eyes remained fixed on the dog as he spoke. Elena was conducting research in the Amazon basin. She'd discovered something remarkable about certain indigenous healing practices involving plant compounds that could affect neural chemistry. She was so excited about the potential applications for treating neurological disorders. His voice caught slightly. "The last transmission we received from her team mentioned they'd made a breakthrough, but then what?" Dr. Martinez had stopped her examination and was listening intently. The team went silent. When the rescue expedition finally reached their camp 3 weeks later, they found evidence of an animal attack. Elena and 2 others were missing, presumed dead. Samuel's hand trembled against the dog's fur, but I never stopped looking. I spent everything I had, followed every lead, hired guides to take me into parts of the jungle that hadn't been mapped. The ambulance had arrived, along with 2 police cars and what appeared to be a van from animal control. Maya could see the EMTs preparing their equipment, but they seemed reluctant to approach the scene, uncertain of what they were dealing with. "You found something," Maya prompted, sensing there was more to the story. Samuel nodded slowly. 2 years ago, I finally made contact with a shaman from one of the remote tribes Elena had been working with. He told me she hadn't died in an animal attack. She'd been changed, infected with something that wasn't quite rabies, but similar. Something that had been altered by the compound she'd been studying. Dr. Martinez felt her breath catch. "You're saying she became something like this dog?" The shaman called it the hunger that thinks. It maintained intelligence, but overlaid it with an overwhelming drive to feed to spread itself. Elena had been trying to find a cure when she disappeared into the deep jungle. Samuel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but she left behind notes, research, formulas. The shaman had kept them safe, hoping someone would come who could understand them. The dog stirred slightly under his touch, and Samuel's attention immediately focused back on the animal. Its breathing seemed stronger now, more regular. Whatever he had done was clearly having an effect. "Is that how you knew what to do here?" Maya asked. "Elena's research?" Her final notes described a kind of neural intervention, a way to temporarily override the infected neural pathways and restore normal brain function. But it required— He hesitated, looking uncomfortable. "Required what?" Dr. Martinez pressed. "Direct neural contact, skin-to-skin transmission of specific bioelectrical patterns." Samuel finally looked up at them, his eyes hollow with grief and exhaustion. Elena had been experimenting on herself. She'd found a way to carry the antidote in her own nervous system, but the process was dangerous. Too dangerous. Understanding dawned on Maya's face. "You injected yourself with something based on her research." Samuel nodded. "I've been carrying it for months now, hoping I'd never need to use it. The compounds are unstable, and each time I use this ability, it causes permanent damage to my own neural pathways." Elena's notes were very clear about the risks. Dr. Martinez moved closer to Samuel, her medical training overriding her skepticism. "What kind of damage?" "Memory loss, motor function deterioration, eventually complete neural shutdown." He managed a weak smile. "I probably have 3 or 4 more uses left before the cumulative effects become irreversible." The EMTs had finally approached and were setting up their equipment nearby, waiting for direction. Animal control officers stood at a respectful distance, clearly uncertain about how to handle a rabid dog that was no longer showing symptoms of rabies. The dog's eyes opened then, clear and alert, no trace of the mindless fury that had possessed it earlier. It looked up at Samuel with what could only be described as gratitude before slowly, carefully rising to its feet. The veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Dr. Martinez's weathered face as she emerged from the examination room, her latex gloves stained with blood. Samuel sat hunched in the waiting area, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The old man hadn't spoken a word since they'd arrived, but his eyes never left the door behind which Ranger lay fighting for his life. "The bite wounds are extensive," Dr. Martinez said softly, settling into the chair beside Samuel. 3 deep punctures along his shoulder and significant tissue damage. "But that's not what concerns me most." Samuel's head lifted slowly, his pale eyes meeting hers. "The virus." She nodded grimly. "We've started him on supportive care, but if that rabid dog transmitted the virus—" She didn't need to finish. They both understood the implications. "How long?" Samuel's voice was barely a whisper. "If he was infected, symptoms could appear anywhere from 2 weeks to several months. Dogs typically show signs within 2 to 8 weeks. Dr. Martinez leaned forward, her expression gentle but direct. "Samuel, I need you to understand something. If Ranger develops rabies, there's no cure. None." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Samuel closed his eyes, and for a moment, the strong, mysterious man who had faced down a rabid beast with supernatural calm looked utterly broken. "There's something else," Dr. Martinez continued. "The police want to talk to you. What you did in that park. People are asking questions. Some are calling it a miracle. Others think it was staged somehow. There's even talk of reporters coming from the city." Samuel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum. "I need to see him." "Of course, but now." The examination room smelled of antiseptic and fear. Ranger lay motionless on the metal table, his breathing shallow, and 4 lines snaking into his foreleg. Bandages covered his shoulder, where the rabid dog's teeth had found their mark. Samuel approached slowly, as if afraid his own footsteps might disturb the fragile thread keeping his companion tethered to life. He placed a trembling hand on Ranger's head, and the dog's eyes fluttered open. Despite the sedation, despite the trauma, Ranger's tail managed the faintest wag. "I'm sorry, boy." Samuel whispered. "I should have been faster. Should have seen it coming." The door opened behind him, and Dr. Martinez entered quietly. "Samuel, there's something you should know. I've been a veterinarian for 37 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened in that park. The way you calmed that animal, the way you seemed to communicate with it. How is that possible?" Samuel continued stroking Ranger's fur, his back still turned to her. "My wife used to say I had a gift, said I could speak to animals in ways others couldn't." His voice carried the weight of decades. "I told her it wasn't a gift, it was a curse." "Why a curse?" "'Cause knowing what they're thinking, what they're feeling, it means you understand their pain, their confusion, their fear." He turned to face her, and Dr. Martinez was startled to see tears streaming down his cheeks. "That dog in the park wasn't evil, Doctor. It was terrified. The virus had taken everything from it, its ability to think clearly, to trust, to feel safe. All that was left was panic and pain. But you helped it find peace. I let it die with dignity instead of fear. But at what cost?" His hand moved protectively over Ranger's still form. "I couldn't save them both." Dr. Martinez watched this broken man standing vigil over his companion and felt something shift inside her chest. "Samuel, what aren't you telling me? This gift of yours, it's not natural, is it?" For a long moment, the only sound was the steady beep of Ranger's heart monitor. Then Samuel spoke, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear him. 40 years ago, I was part of a government research program. They were experimenting with ways to enhance human-animal communication for military applications. They used techniques that changed us, changed how our brains processed animal behavior, animal thoughts. He looked down at his hands as if seeing them for the first time. Most of the test subjects couldn't handle it. The constant noise, the overwhelming flood of animal consciousness. Suicide rates were high, but you survived. I learned to cope, found Ranger as a puppy, and discovered that having one strong bond helped filter out the rest. He became my anchor." Samuel's voice broke. "Without him, the voices all come back. Every animal within miles, their thoughts, their emotions, flooding into my head without mercy." Dr. Martinez felt her breath catch. "And if we lose him?" Samuel's silence was answer enough. Outside, the sun was setting, casting the clinic in amber light. In the distance, she could hear sirens, probably the reporters he'd mentioned, drawn by the mystery of the man who could tame wild beasts. But looking at Samuel now, she realized the real story wasn't about a gift at all. It was about a man living with an unimaginable burden, and the dog who made that burden bearable. The morning sun cast long shadows across the veterinary clinic as Dr. Sarah Chen reviewed the test results for the third time. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the papers, the clinical data painting a picture she had hoped never to see. The rabies virus had progressed further than any case in medical literature, yet somehow the dog remained docile, almost serene. "This is impossible," she whispered to her assistant, Marcus, who was preparing another blood sample. "The viral load should have killed him days ago, but look at these neurological readings. It's like something is actively suppressing the symptoms." Marcus glanced up from his microscope. "Maybe it's a new strain? Something we haven't encountered before?" Sarah shook her head, studying the brain scans they had taken yesterday. The virus was there, aggressive and widespread, but contained within specific neural pathways. It reminded her of controlled demolition, destructive force channeled with surgical precision. Across town, Elena Morrison sat in her kitchen, staring at the phone number Professor Hartwell had given her. She had spent the night researching everything she could find about animal communication, from scientific studies to fringe theories. Nothing explained what she had witnessed in the park. The old man's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes the greatest gift comes with the greatest price. What price had he paid? And why did he seem so familiar with suffering? She dialed the number, her heart racing as it rang. Dr. Patricia Vance speaking. "Dr. Vance." This is Elena Morrison from Millbrook. Professor Hartwell gave me your number. I need to ask you about animal behavioral research, specifically about human-animal communication. There was a pause. What exactly did you witness, Miss Morrison? Elena took a deep breath and recounted everything: the rabid dog, the old man's approach, the impossible calm that had settled over the situation. She described the man's eyes, the way the dog had responded, the inexplicable connection between them. "My God," Dr. Vance breathed when Elena finished. "You're describing something theoretical, something we've only hypothesized about in laboratory settings. Can you describe this man in more detail?" Elderly, probably 70s, silver hair, deep blue eyes. He had this quiet confidence, like he'd done it before. And there was something sad about him, something haunted. Another pause. "Miss Morrison, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before answering. Did this man show any signs of unusual behavior himself? Any twitching, disorientation, sensitivity to light or sound?" Elena's blood chilled. "Why would you ask that?" "Because what you're describing, true neurological communication with a rabid animal, would require an unprecedented understanding of the virus itself. In theoretical models, the only way to achieve that level of connection would be through direct neural interface, which would mean he's infected too," Elena finished, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. Dr. Vance's voice was gentle but urgent. "If I'm right, this man represents a medical miracle and a tremendous danger. The virus affects human brains differently than animal brains. If he's found a way to control it, to use it as a communication medium, he's achieved something that could revolutionize our understanding of neurology. But he's also a walking time bomb." Elena ended the call with shaking hands and immediately drove to the clinic. She found Dr. Chen in the laboratory, bent over charts and test results. "Dr. Chen, I need to tell you something about the man who helped with the dog." Sarah looked up, noting Elena's pale complexion and worried expression. "What is it?" Elena explained her conversation with Dr. Vance, watching as the veterinarian's face grew increasingly grave. "That would explain the anomalies in the dog's condition," Sarah murmured. "If someone with an advanced understanding of the virus made contact, influenced its progression somehow." She trailed off, then grabbed Elena's arm. "We need to find this man immediately. If Dr. Vance is correct, he needs medical attention desperately." They left the clinic together, driving through Millbrook's quiet streets, as Elena tried to remember every detail about the mysterious stranger. Where would someone go if they were carrying such a terrible secret? Where would they wait out the inevitable progression of a disease they could control but not cure? The park was empty when they arrived, but Elena felt drawn to the spot where the encounter had occurred. Something white caught her eye near the base of an old oak tree, a folded piece of paper weighted down with a smooth stone. She opened it with trembling fingers, recognizing the careful handwriting from her brief glimpse of the man. "By the time you read this, you'll understand what I am and what I've done. The gift and the curse are one and the same. The dog will recover. I've given him what peace I could, but my time is ending, and there are things you need to know about what's coming to your town. Meet me at the old mill at sunset, come alone, and bring your courage. The truth is harder than the mystery." Elena looked up at Dr. Chen, both women realizing that their quiet town was about to face something far more complex and dangerous than a single rabid animal. The veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Dr. Sarah Chen finished her examination of the dog. Her hands moved with practiced gentleness, checking the animal's reflexes, temperature, and neurological responses. The massive German shepherd lay calm on the metal table, occasionally lifting his head to look toward Marcus, who stood pressed against the far wall. "This is impossible," Dr. Chen murmured, stepping back from the table. "According to every test I've run, this dog should be dead. The rabies has progressed, far beyond the point of no return, yet," she gestured helplessly at the docile animal, "he's responding to commands, showing no aggression, and his vital signs are stabilizing." Sheriff Morrison crossed his arms. So what are you saying, Doc? I'm saying I've never seen anything like this in 30 years of veterinary medicine. She turned to Marcus, who hadn't moved from his position by the wall. What exactly did you do out there? Marcus's weathered hands trembled as he reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small, worn leather journal. The binding was cracked with age, the pages yellowed and soft from countless readings. He held it against his chest for a moment before speaking. 43 years ago, I was Dr. Marcus Whitmore, head of animal behavioral research at the State University. His voice carried the weight of decades. I had a theory about animal consciousness, about the deeper connections between species that science couldn't explain. My colleagues thought I was losing my mind. The dog's ears perked up at Marcus's voice, and he lifted his head with what could only be described as recognition. I had a research partner, Marcus continued, his eyes growing distant. A brilliant young graduate student named Elena Vasquez. She believed in my work when no one else would. Together we discovered that certain animals, especially those in extreme distress, could form what we called empathic bridges with humans who possess the right sensitivity. Dr. Chen frowned. Empathic bridges? That sounds like pseudoscience. That's what the university board said. Marcus's laugh was bitter. But Elena and we proved it worked. We could calm aggressive animals, help traumatized pets recover, even communicate basic emotions. The applications were limitless. Sheriff Morrison leaned forward. What happened? We were working with a pack of feral dogs that had been terrorizing a rural community. 7 animals, all showing signs of severe psychological trauma from abuse. Elena insisted on trying our technique on the pack leader, a massive mixed breed that had already injured 3 people. Marcus's hands tightened on the journal. I told her it was too dangerous, that we needed more time to understand the process. But she was convinced she could reach him. The room fell silent except for the dog's steady breathing. The empathic bridge worked, Marcus whispered, too well. Elena didn't just calm the animal, she absorbed its trauma, its fear, its rage. The connection overwhelmed her nervous system. She collapsed on the spot and never regained consciousness. She died 3 days later. Dr. Chen's expression softened. I'm sorry for your loss, but what does this have to do with... The university destroyed all our research, Marcus interrupted. Called it dangerous pseudoscience. Blamed Elena's death on a dog attack. I was fired, discredited, and blacklisted from every academic institution in the country. He opened the journal, revealing pages covered in meticulous handwriting and detailed diagrams. This is all that remains of our life's work. The dog suddenly stood on the examination table, looking directly at Marcus with an intelligence that seemed almost human. After Elena died, I swore I'd never use the technique again. I became a drifter, moving from town to town, trying to forget. But animals, they still sense something in me. They're drawn to me, especially the ones in pain. He looked at the German Shepherd. When I saw this boy in the park, dying and terrified, I couldn't just walk away. Elena would never have forgiven me. Sheriff Morrison stepped closer. So, you're telling us you can actually communicate with animals? Not communicate exactly. It's more like sharing consciousness, feeling what they feel, understanding their emotional state on a level deeper than words. Marcus approached the examination table slowly. The dog's tail wagged once, a gentle acknowledgement. This boy wasn't just suffering from rabies. He was lost, confused, searching for something. In his mind, I saw flashes of a small girl with pigtails who used to throw a tennis ball for him in a backyard. She's gone now, has been for months. He's been looking for her ever since. Dr. Chen watched in amazement as the dog nuzzled Marcus's outstretched hand. The rabies symptoms? Still there, still fatal. But the fear and confusion are gone. He understands now. Marcus's voice broke slightly. He knows he can rest. The dog settled back onto the table, his breathing slow and peaceful. Outside, the first hints of dawn crept through the clinic windows, painting everything in soft gold. The veterinary clinic hummed with quiet activity as Dr. Sarah Chen finished reviewing the test results for what felt like the 100th time. 3 days had passed since Magnus had calmed the rabid dog in the park, and the implications of what she'd witnessed continued to challenge everything she thought she knew about animal behavior and disease. The dog, now named Hope by the shelter staff, showed no signs of aggression. More remarkably, subsequent tests revealed the virus was present, but somehow dormant, as if held in check by an invisible force. Sarah had consulted with colleagues across the country, but none could explain the phenomenon. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Magnus stood in the doorway, his weathered face etched with exhaustion. The past few days had taken their toll on him. The effort of maintaining his connection with Hope, combined with the weight of his secret finally being shared, had aged him visibly. "How is she?" he asked, settling into the chair across from Sarah's desk. "Stable. The virus levels haven't increased, which should be impossible. Magnus, what you did, what you're still doing, it's beyond anything medical science can explain." Magnus nodded slowly. "It's not sustainable. I can feel the strain on both of us. The connection requires constant energy, and I'm not as young as I once was." Sarah leaned forward. "There has to be another way. What if we could understand the mechanism behind your ability? Maybe replicate it somehow?" "You're thinking like a scientist," Magnus said with a tired smile. "But this isn't something that can be bottled or reproduced. It comes from decades of understanding, of listening, of becoming something more than human while remaining fundamentally connected to our humanity." Through the window, they could see the town park where the incident had occurred. Normal life had resumed. Children played on the swings, joggers followed their usual routes, dogs chased frisbees. But Sarah knew that everyone who'd witnessed Magnus's intervention carried the memory of something extraordinary. "The town council met yesterday," Sarah said. "They want to honor you somehow. Maybe name the park after you." Magnus shook his head. "Recognition was never the point. I've spent 40 years trying to atone for what I did to Fenris, to find some way to heal the wound I created through my arrogance. Every animal I've helped since then has been an attempt to balance the scales. And Hope? What happens to her? She's fighting the virus in ways that nature never intended. But the battle is taking its toll. I can sense her confusion, her struggle between the disease's demands and her natural instincts. She's trapped between two worlds, much like I've been all these years." Sarah studied Magnus's face, seeing the pain he carried. "You blame yourself for more than just Fenris, don't you? After my research was discredited, after I lost everything, I retreated into the wilderness. For years, I helped animals in secret, but I also encountered others I couldn't save. Creatures driven mad by human interference, pollution, habitat destruction, experimental contaminations. Each one was a reminder of how our species' ambition often comes at the cost of innocent lives." The clinic's phone rang, interrupting them. Sarah answered, her expression growing grave as she listened. When she hung up, her face was pale. That was the State Health Department. They've received reports of similar incidents in 3 other states. Rabid animals suddenly becoming docile after encounters with unidentified individuals. They're launching an investigation. Magnus closed his eyes, the weight of this revelation settling over him. Others like me. Is that possible? I thought I was alone, but perhaps my research influenced others before it was buried. Maybe there are people who found different ways to develop these connections." He paused, then looked directly at Sarah. "Or maybe the world is changing in ways we don't understand, and nature is calling forth those who can bridge the gap between species." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "What does that mean for Hope? For you?" "It means my time here is ending. But it also means Hope might have a chance at something I never dared imagine. A complete healing, not just a temporary reprieve." As if summoned by their conversation, Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway. "Sarah, you need to see this. Hope's latest blood work shows something incredible. The virus levels aren't just stable, they're decreasing, and there's something else. Her neural activity suggests she's not just fighting the infection, she's somehow processing it, learning from it. Magnus stood slowly, his eyes bright with a mixture of hope and determination. She's evolving, adapting in ways the virus never anticipated. The connection isn't just suppressing the disease, it's teaching her immune system to transform it into something benign. Sarah looked between the two men, understanding dawning on her face. If this works, if Hope recovers completely, it could change everything, not just for rabies treatment, but for how we understand the relationship between humans and animals. Magnus nodded, but his expression remained serious. The question is whether I can maintain the connection long enough for the transformation to complete itself. The laboratory fell silent, except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Dr. Sarah Chen stared at the test results spread across her desk, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her phone. The blood samples from both the dog and Samuel had revealed something that defied everything she thought she knew about rabies transmission and progression. "Marcus, you need to get down here immediately," she whispered into the receiver, her voice barely audible. "And bring Sheriff Williams. What I'm about to show you changes everything." 20 minutes later, Marcus burst through the lab doors with the sheriff close behind. Both men looked exhausted, their faces etched with the strain of the past few days. The town had been in lockdown since the incident at the park, with animal control teams scouring every street and alley for signs of other infected animals. "Sarah, please tell me you have answers," Marcus said, slumping into a chair. "The CDC team arrives tomorrow, and the media is calling this the worst rabies outbreak in decades. People are terrified to leave their homes." Dr. Chen picked up the first set of lab reports, her scientific training warring with the impossibility of what she was about to reveal. The dog tested positive for rabies, as we expected, but Marcus, this wasn't a normal strain. The viral load was unlike anything I've ever seen. It should have killed the animal within days, not weeks. Sheriff Williams stepped forward, his weathered face creased with confusion. "What are you saying, Doc?" "I'm saying this dog lived with an advanced rabies infection far longer than should have been medically possible. And that's not the strangest part." She held up Samuel's blood work, the numbers highlighted in yellow marker. Samuel's blood shows exposure to the rabies virus, but his immune system isn't fighting it, it's coexisting with it. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Marcus finally found his voice. "Coexisting? That's impossible. Rabies is always fatal once symptoms appear." "That's what we've always believed," Dr. Chen replied, pulling up a chair. "But Samuel's cellular structure shows adaptations I've never seen. His nervous system has somehow learned to accommodate the virus without succumbing to it. It's as if he's evolved a symbiotic relationship with rabies itself." Sheriff Williams removed his hat, running his fingers through his grey hair. "You're telling me that old man is infected with rabies and just walking around our town?" "Not infected," Dr. Chen corrected. "Changed. The virus in his system is different from the one we found in the dog. It's been modified somehow, domesticated. And based on the antibody markers, this adaptation happened decades ago." Marcus leaned forward, his mind racing, the scars on his arms. "Sarah, what if those weren't random animal attacks? What if Samuel deliberately exposed himself to rabies-infected animals over the years?" The implications hit them like a physical blow. Dr. Chen nodded slowly, pieces of an impossible puzzle falling into place. If someone were to gradually introduce small amounts of modified rabies virus into their system, theoretically their body might adapt. But the risk would be enormous. One miscalculation, and they'd die horribly. "Why would anyone take that risk?" Sheriff Williams asked. "To save others," Marcus whispered, remembering Samuel's words at the park. "He told me he'd seen too much death, that he couldn't let it happen again. What if he's been deliberately infecting himself to develop immunity, then using that immunity to help rabid animals?" Dr. Chen pulled out a magnifying glass and gestured to a slide under her microscope. "Look at this. The rabies virus in Samuel's blood has been altered at the genetic level. It's almost as if he's learned to communicate with the virus, to modify its behavior." As Marcus peered through the microscope, his phone rang. The caller ID showed the number for Mercy General Hospital. "This is Marcus," he answered. "Dr. Torres, this is Nurse Patterson. Your patient Samuel Morrison is awake. And sir, there's something else. He's asking for you specifically, and he says he needs to tell you about the others before it's too late." The phone nearly slipped from Marcus's hands. Others? What others? He won't say, but he keeps insisting that the dog wasn't alone. He says there are more infected animals in the woods, and without his help, they'll come into town looking for him. Sheriff Williams was already reaching for his radio. "All units, this is Sheriff Williams. I need immediate patrols on all roads leading from the forest preserve. No one enters or exits without clearance." Dr. Chen gathered her files with urgent efficiency. If Samuel has been managing a population of rabid animals in those woods, keeping them calm through some kind of viral communication, then his absence could trigger them to seek him out. They might be drawn to his scent, his presence. Marcus was already heading for the door. "We need to get to the hospital. If Samuel really has found a way to control rabies, to communicate with infected animals, then he might be our only hope of preventing a true outbreak." As they rushed toward their vehicles, none of them noticed the shadows moving at the edge of the forest or the sound of paws padding softly on the asphalt behind them. The morning sun cast long shadows across the empty park as Thomas sat on the weathered bench, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he held the leather journal. Dr. Sarah Chen approached slowly, her footsteps careful on the dew-dampened grass. The events of yesterday still hung heavy in the air between them, unspoken questions demanding answers. "You came," Thomas said without looking up, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "I had to." Sarah settled beside him, noticing how the old man seemed smaller somehow, as if revealing his secret had diminished him physically. "That dog, Rex, he wasn't just any animal to you, was he?" Thomas opened the journal, its pages yellowed with age. Sarah glimpsed newspaper clippings, faded photographs, and handwritten notes in multiple languages. 47 years, he whispered. "I've been tracking the virus mutations for 47 years. Sarah's breath caught as Thomas turned to a page showing a younger version of himself in military fatigues, standing beside a German shepherd. The resemblance to Rex was unmistakable, the same intelligent eyes, the same proud stance. "His name was Bruno," Thomas continued, his finger tracing the photograph's edge. "My partner in the Army's Veterinary Research Division. We were studying rabies variants in Southeast Asia, trying to develop better vaccines for military working dogs." His voice cracked slightly. "I thought I was helping them. Instead, I created something monstrous." The pieces began falling into place for Sarah. The viral strain that infected Rex was my creation. Thomas's admission hung between them like a physical weight, an experimental modification designed to enhance the immune response. But something went wrong. Instead of immunity, it created a super strain that lay dormant for weeks before manifesting with unprecedented aggression. Sarah watched as Thomas turned pages, revealing documentation of his decades-long pursuit. Maps marked with red X's spanning continents, photographs of infected animals, notes detailing behavioral patterns she now recognized from Rex's case. "Bruno was patient zero," Thomas explained. After I had to..." He stopped, composing himself. "I spent my life's work tracking every descendant, every animal that carried even a trace of that modified virus. Rex wasn't the first, Dr. Chen. He was the 43rd. The magnitude of Thomas's burden struck Sarah like a physical blow. For nearly 5 decades, this man had carried the guilt of his scientific mistake, hunting down its consequences one by one. The way you approached Rex yesterday, how you knew exactly what to do. Each encounter taught me more about the virus's behavior, its patterns. I learned that in the final stages, there's a window, a brief moment when the animal's original personality resurfaces. If you know what to look for, you can reach them." Thomas's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "But the cost is always the same. They have to die, and I have to be the one to make that choice." Sarah noticed the small vial in Thomas's jacket pocket, the same one he'd used yesterday. The sedative is laced with a compound I developed. It doesn't cure them, but it allows them to die as themselves rather than as the monster the virus created. He pulled out the vial, its contents reflecting the morning light. For just a moment, they remember who they were before the infection took hold. The park around them was beginning to show signs of life. Joggers in the distance, the sound of children playing at a nearby playground. Normal life continuing, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded here just 24 hours earlier. "Why tell me this?" Sarah asked. "You could have walked away. No one would have questioned your methods." Thomas closed the journal and looked directly at her for the first time that morning. "Because I'm dying, Dr. Chen. Cancer. 6 months, maybe less." He held up a second journal, its leather binding newer than the first. "And because Rex wasn't just number 43, my research indicates he was the last." Sarah's heart raced. "The last?" "The viral strain appears to have finally burned itself out. After nearly 5 decades, the genetic modifications have degraded to the point where they can no longer sustain themselves." Thomas handed her the second journal. "This contains everything. My research, the antiviral protocols, the tracking methods. If I'm wrong, if there are others, someone needs to continue the work." Sarah accepted the journal with trembling hands, understanding the magnitude of what was being entrusted to her. "Thomas, what you've done, spending your life fixing your mistake, doesn't bring back the animals who suffered," he interrupted, standing slowly. "Doesn't undo the pain their families endured, but maybe it prevents others from experiencing what we witnessed yesterday." As Thomas walked away across the park, Sarah opened the journal to its first page. In careful handwriting she read, "For those who must carry burdens they never chose, may they find the strength to see them through." The morning sun climbed higher, warming the bench where she sat, holding 47 years of one man's redemption in her hands. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millfield Park as Dr. Sarah Chen finished packing the last of her equipment into the veterinary van. The tranquilizer gun lay secured in its case, unused. 3 days had passed since the incident that would forever change how the town viewed both wildlife and the quiet man who had lived among them unnoticed for so many years. Thomas Hartwell sat on the bench where it had all begun, his weathered hands resting on his knees as he watched a family of squirrels play in the oak tree above. The rabid dog, Rex, as he'd learned the animal's name had been, was buried now in a small cemetery outside town, his suffering finally at peace. "Mind if I join you?" Sarah approached slowly, carrying 2 cups of coffee from Murphy's diner. Thomas looked up, his eyes still holding that same impossible calm she'd witnessed when he'd faced down a diseased and dangerous animal with nothing but whispered words and gentle movements. "Of course, Doctor." She settled beside him, offering one of the cups. "The lab results came back this morning. Rex was in the final stages of rabies. What you did, it should have been impossible." Thomas sipped his coffee, watching a young mother push her toddler on the nearby swing set. Life had returned to the park, cautious but determined. "I spent 43 years in these woods, Sarah, 43 years learning to listen. The townspeople are calling it a miracle. Some say you're some kind of animal whisperer." She paused, studying his profile. "But that's not the whole story, is it?" A ghost of a smile crossed his lined face. "Stories are funny things. People see what they need to see." He gestured toward the playground where children laughed and played. "They needed to see that connection still exists, that understanding is possible, even in the darkest moments." Sarah had spent the past 3 days researching, making calls to wildlife organizations across the country. The picture that emerged was of a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to understanding animal behavior, who had published groundbreaking research on interspecies communication before disappearing from academic circles decades ago. "Dr. Thomas Hartwell," she said softly. "The Thomas Hartwell. You wrote Voices in the Wild. I studied your work in veterinary school." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the squirrels chase each other in an endless spiral around the oak's trunk. That was another lifetime. Another man who thought he could change the world with words on a page. You did change the world. Your research on animal cognition, on emotional intelligence in wildlife, it revolutionized how we approach conservation. And yet here we are, Thomas said, his voice carrying a weight of years, still building walls between ourselves and the natural world, still surprised when an old man can calm a suffering animal. A jogger passed by, nodding respectfully to Thomas. Word had spread quickly through Millfield about what had happened. The mysterious hermit had become something of a local legend overnight, though he seemed uncomfortable with the attention. "Why did you leave it all behind?" Sarah asked. "The university, the research, the recognition?" Thomas set down his coffee cup and folded his hands. "Because I realized I was studying something that was dying. Every paper I published, every lecture I gave, I was documenting the last conversations between two worlds that were drifting apart." He paused, his eyes growing distant. "My wife used to say I was trying to build a bridge with words when what was needed was presence. She understood your work? She understood me better than I understood myself." His voice grew soft. "Elena died 30 years ago this fall. Cancer. After she was gone, I couldn't bear to sit in lecture halls talking about connection while feeling so utterly disconnected myself." Sarah felt the pieces falling into place. The decades of solitude, the choice to live simply among the creatures he'd spent his career studying, the deep wellspring of patience and understanding that had allowed him to reach a rabid dog when no one else could. "So you came here." "So I came here. And I listened, really listened, for the first time in my life." He stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement. Rex wasn't aggressive, you know. He was terrified, confused. The disease had taken away everything that made sense to him, but somewhere deep down he remembered what kindness felt like. As they walked together toward the park's entrance, Sarah realized that Thomas Hartwell had become exactly what the world needed. Not another expert talking about nature from a distance, but a living bridge between two worlds that had forgotten how to speak to each other. "Will you stay in Millfield?" she asked. Thomas paused at the edge of the park, looking back at the oak tree where it had all unfolded. "I think so. It seems this old town still has things to teach me." As he walked away, Sarah understood that some stories don't end. They simply transform, becoming part of the larger conversation between all living things.